Okay, I think we're ready to start with the afternoon session, training on scenarios and models. I have very good news, probably the most interesting session. Who would not want to start dreaming of the future? A future with, which you can all choose with no surprises? Well, I will have to disappoint you slightly. We'll go beyond that. We'll not only think about expected futures, we'll think about possible futures, plausible futures of future change in agriculture and food systems and its impact on ecosystem service and biodiversity. Who would be comfortable in flying this plane? I think this is a bit, I see some heads nodding. I think it's a bit the same with the TEEB studies. You will need some tools and approaches to follow, which are not that straightforward. And we found that these scenarios and models from our previous TEEB country studies are really useful to really understand and communicate the effects of ecosystem service changes. If you look to this graph that is not coming up, there it is. How would this graph look like without scenarios? Somebody? It would basically just be the blue bar of current state of its ecosystem services. In previous sessions, you have seen that comparing different policies can really visualize these trade-offs that you see as well in this graph. There is no single recipe for scenario development or creating storylines, but we'll discuss some do's and don'ts. One of them in the second bullet, really this policy alignment, and we'll talk more about that. Defining the spatial and temporal dimension, we'll discuss that as well. The stakeholder engagement, where the process of engaging stakeholders is at least as important, often more important than the end result of your scenario or your modeling results itself. Some of the drivers as well that we'll look at that are really the foundations of some of the scenarios. In which they shape really the direction, the magnitude, and the rate of future change. We'll also look in different visualization options for these scenarios as well. So we have identified some challenges, some dimension of good scenario development. The first one, relevance, linking again to the policy relevance, what has been going in the previous days, really pressing always, it needs to be policy relevant for stakeholders. Participatory, what I just mentioned, legitimate, have you included the different views of stakeholders as well? I see some people noting down, these slides will be provided to you as well with notes, just to mention, but go ahead in taking notes. Then as well, plausible scenarios. It seems quite obvious, but can your scenario really happen that you're developing? Is it a coherent story that you're making? Distinct, contrasting scenarios where you have to get a good balance as well. Does it clearly show these trade-offs? Extremely important as well if you're looking to different spatial configurations. Scientifically credible. Also rather obvious, but it's even the most simple things. Land use change, does it add up to 100%? We have seen also different assumptions on driving that may be in conflict. So these things also look to these. Comprehensive, did you actually include all the drivers? Again, very relevant also in our holistic framework. Here I'm presenting on this slide a graph, a framework developed by IBES, and this is actually very useful to see how how you can link different scenario types to different policy phases. So if you see here the outer circle, you see the 4 policy phases. You see agenda setting, design, implementation, and review. Within the circle, you see different policy types. We've seen with TEEB country studies, most often we're going to take the intervention scenarios. So that's the 2 on the right side, target seeking scenarios and policy screening scenarios. I'll come back on that one. First, let's go to the left upper corner, where you have exploratory scenarios. So what's that? There you see basically the dashed lines that you see there. They represent plausible futures. So you assess basically the need for action. You're not yet in the actual policy making. You assess the need for action. It's very well suited for when you need to put attention of policymakers on different emergent problems. And in its basic form, it can just be projections, extrapolations of current trends. So this scenario type basically gives advantage of first looking into more flexibility and creativity to construct your storyline. But then if you actually want to move to actual action, policy action, we move to the target seeking scenario and the policy screening scenario. The difference between these two, so on the right side up, target seeking scenarios, you see the diamond on the right. That's a target that's already been agreed. Often a high level target, it can be an IHE, biodiversity target, it can be the SDGs. And the dashed lines again, they show the trajectory on how to reach that target. And you can go analyzing these pathways and then afterwards model them. Then in the right down corner, the policy screening scenarios, there you're going to basically assess different policies that are under consideration. So that's what we most often apply at TEEB. It can, for example, be a tax on pesticides, for example, that's being under consideration. One note, there is no one-to-one correspondence on this policy cycle in these scenarios. It's often it ends up being a combination of different scenario types, so that you can actually use a blended approach. But what we have seen often again at the national scale, you have these policy scenarios as the most being applied. I'm not going to explain you this one. This is basically more explaining on these different types of scenarios. We'll use it afterwards in our exercise, in our group exercise. So we come now to the spatial dimension. First, maybe to say, and you will all know, every environmental problem solution has a spatial dimension. And this context is really important. If you have the global numbers that we have seen in some of the reports of X amount of I don't know the exact number, but for example, 150 liters of water needed for 1 kilogram of beef, that's great for raising awareness. But then actually, if you want to go look at the spatial level, you'll have to see, are you in a water-rich area? Are you in water-poor area? So this context, this spatial dimension is again very relevant, and you need to go look at the spatial dimension, spatial scale for your country studies. To explain again there, it depends very much on the scope of your study again, what spatial dimension you will be choosing. And basically to give you an example of the second bullet that is here presented, you may be informing a policy at provincial level. That doesn't mean that your analysis will be at that scale as well. You may want to work at a more broader scale for your analysis to get more the biophysical linkages of a wider area as well. As well as then again combining multiple scales. Drivers again, they function at multiple scales, so you may also want to work at multiple scales. What is represented in this picture, also produced by IBAS. the time dimension, again, very much dependent on the objective of your TEEB study. And if you see on the first graph scenarios being linked to different temporal scales. You have the short term, you have the medium term, long term, short term. You may have, actually the SDGs are starting to be short term in terms of scenario development. Longer term, if you want to look, for example, at 50 years, for example, for reforestation, for forest regrowth. What could also be of interest is to look to multiple time scales. If you look, for example, at 50 years reforestation, maybe your reforestation will happen the first 5 years and the last 5 years of your 50 years time scale that you're considering. So again, there, it's important to also again link it to your decision making, your policy question, where you probably also need short-term and longer-term considerations to take into account. The number or the amount of scenarios or storylines that you would want to look at. Again, that's very much a balance you'll need to find between being the minimum level of representing complexity, and then as well having sufficiently contrasting scenarios where you can really again see these trade-offs. We have seen with two scenarios, you may often represent very much the extremes, a bit the polarized version. What can be useful in some scenario exercises, but you could also look to more scenarios. 3 scenarios often could be the problem that they pick the middle scenario, thinking this is the most likely or preferred scenario. 4 scenarios, even number again, actors may be more likely to look at a full range, and there you could even look to 5 or more. Again, there comes in the trade-off, is it going to be sufficiently contrasting? So that's also an exercise you have to go through if you want to look to different number of scenarios. Stakeholder engagement. Again, this has been discussed multiple times this morning as well, how you're going to the process. Again, also very much a defining feature of constructing your scenarios. Not only for defining that first policy scope, also for developing these scenarios. You'll need to consult with stakeholders, look back to your data, and make this an iterative process as well, which you see in these dashed lines here. Even when you're going to present first results to decision makers, you will have to collect feedback and look back how can you refine some of the findings or some of the scenarios even that you have constructed to make it as much policy relevant as possible. Again, critical that the stakeholders are there involved from the onset and also at the relevant scale. If you're looking at a local problem, indigenous land, 80% indigenous land, yes, you involve the indigenous people like Colombia just presented before lunch. Here you see some of the benefits of stakeholder involvement also in this scenario construction: legitimacy, transparency, ownership. Champions means again involving this decision analysis and these decision makers in the scenario construction as well. Otherwise you may not have their buy-in when it comes to the results and they don't agree with your scenario development. Let's now go to the drivers. Basically for scenario construction, it begins with the development of your qualitative storyline that you're going to translate into drivers. Drivers, again, these foundations of your story or of your scenario. Again, they shape the direction, the dimension of your future change. Shouldn't be seen as something static. These drivers, these interact with each other. Again, there you'll see more after how to model that as well. And you may need different models to show this interaction between drivers as well. Key questions when you're looking to drivers. Which drivers? How many are you going to include? What scale of drivers again? Drivers that are within your control, also at international level, all considerations to take into account and to link again to the TEEB evaluation framework. Another important aspect is that you may actually already at this stage where you're going to construct your storylines, that you're already going to look into data, into accessing data. Most scenarios start really with understanding the current situation. So you collect data, local knowledge on the current land use, and then you basically present this to the stakeholders as they start thinking about plausible futures. Very briefly, just to mention, there are a lot of different visualization options. Maps are very important in that regard. So try to be creative in using maps in different ways. I'm not going to go over it in detail, but you can even have now, and we'll look there also up into in the future, the MapX platform, for example, where you just are able to show the importance of communicating maps, and you can actually combine it with storytelling as well, where you don't need the GIS expertise as well to use the MapX platform, but you can interact with GIS data without being an expert. This slide, just to show the difference with the TEEB country studies. So it's not just a study, it's a full process. Working very much on this science policy interface. So linking science and policy processes at an early stage, jointly developing these TEEB goals and adapt them over the time, evaluate them, monitor them, where the starting point is again this policy relevance, and you look again in this TEEB study process here, you see stakeholder engagement is at all stages. How many people have heard about the TEEB 6-step approach before? At your national workshops, possibly? I see some hands going up. Most of you will have had the TEEB 6-step approach during the first scoping workshops, the first inception workshop. It's really good to go through that process again. Again, looking at the first step where you find the objective of your study, look to the different stakeholders that you need to involve. And if you link it then again to scenario development, you'll see again that this is an iterative process where you have to go back, using the results, go back to your scenario construction and link it again to some modeling exercise further on. We'll start now with a group exercise. In that group exercise, you're going to work first with two of the policy scenarios that I have explained to you before. So you're going to construct different storylines. We'll go divide you not necessarily per country. We'll probably mix up two countries. So you can use also hypothetical examples. It doesn't need to be necessarily applied to your specific country study that you're currently applying. You can use hypothetical examples or other policy concerns that you see really of interest to being informed by a TEEB study, of course linked to agriculture and food systems. We'll hand out worksheets where the detailed tasks are explained. They're also there up on the board, but we'll come around with facilitators to guide you through the process. I think we could possibly put Colombia together. Is Mexico in the room? Yeah. Colombia together with Mexico, would that work? Tanzania, Kenya, we may have a big group, or would this also work? Yes, because I see some people left to DEFCO. So Kenya and Tanzania, Thailand, Indonesia. Are there other countries? A group with China and Brazil, indeed, sorry. I think we have everybody, and people that are left out, they can join the group of their preference, of their interest. So if possibly Mexico could move.
How many copies do I have here?
A few per group.